Good evening, El Paso. Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where our mission is to share the fun of the big questions with you. My name is Dr. Kim Diaz, and I teach philosophy here at El Paso Community College.
And my name is Jules Simon, and I teach philosophy at the University of Texas, El Paso.
Today, we feel very grateful to be here interviewing none other than Ms. Manuela Gomez, with whom we've had the honor of working for the last 15 years. Ms. Gomez and I met in an American philosophy graduate class at Texas A&M. We were both graduate students, 2004, long time ago. And I don't remember how, if you went first, we were going around in the seminar, everybody was introducing themselves. And I don't remember if you went first or if I went first, but I just remember you and I were the only Hispanics for miles. And I just remember hearing somebody else from El Paso and Juarez was studying philosophy in the same room.
At the exact same time.
Yeah.
Something historical.
Like, yes, so I'll never forget that moment. Ms. Gomez is very successful, very accomplished. Some of her accomplishments are she's a philosophy professor here at El Paso Community College, and she has been teaching for over 15 years on both sides of the border. Her areas of specialty are philosophical pedagogy, ethics, feminism, and Latin American philosophy. Ms. Gomez is also a journalist whose focus is on the U.S.-Mexico border politics. She's also finishing her doctorate degree in teaching, learning, and culture at the University of Texas at El Paso. She's the author of several books, including Rediscovering the Philosophical Importance of Jose Ingenieros, A Bridge Between Two Worlds, as well as an open educational resource ethics textbook. She has published multiple academic articles and book reviews, and in 2017, she received a competitive educator scholarship to attend Yale University to learn more about multiculturalism in education. And also in 2019, she presented her work on philosophy and the border pedagogy at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India, and she was appointed to the National Committee for the Society for the Advancement for American Philosophy to oversee diversity. In 2019, Ms. Gomez was also awarded the Success Through Technology Education Award for the EPCC Philosophies Club contributions to the community and for solving real-world problems. In 2012, Ms. Gomez created the Philosophy Club, and she has been the main advisor since. Also in this last decade, Ms. Gomez and her students have raised over $40,000 for community projects. That's so impressive. In 2020, she received the EPCC Outstanding Faculty Achievement Award for the 2020 EPCC Inspirational Award 2 years in a row by the Student Government Association. The El Paso Community Foundation, along with KVIA-TV, named Ms. Gomez and her club the 2020 Community Champions for their philanthropic work during the COVID-19 pandemic. Recently, this year, Ms. Gomez was appointed to the APA Committee on Hispanics, and she won the EPCC's nomination for the 2021 Minnie Stevens Piper Professor Excellence Award for the state of Texas. She was also recently a guest lecturer at Harvard University for her work on the U.S.-Mexico border, and currently she serves as the EPCC District-wide Coordinator for the Philosophy discipline. She's a coordinator for faculty development, faculty campus coordinator at Valle Verde, as well as a faculty senator. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. You're so busy, so thank you for joining us today.
What a long list of achievements.
Thank you for inviting me, and congratulations on this very much needed project.
Thank you. So who else, as you could see from her research, her accomplishments, Ms. Gomez has been living on both sides of the border, doing research on both sides of the border, and I feel this is so appropriate for us to have her here. So, Ms. Gomez, in your opinion and experience, what is La Frontera?
So I think borders are different everywhere in the world. They can be categorized as physical or metaphysical. And I think when we say la frontera, we're talking specifically about the US-Mexico border. So that immediately tells us we're talking about a different kind of border. If we want to quote one of my favorite philosophers, Juan Gabriel, he says, aquí todo es diferente, everything is different here. We live in a space of complex hybridity. There's this navigation of in-betweenness. It's a very interesting world. To me, it's a place that I call home.
What is metaphysics?
The traditional answer is beyond the physical world. So we have a lot of physical divisions between us. We have a separation of border walls. We have concrete bridges that separate the US and Mexico. But then there's so much that happens beyond the physical, which is metaphysical. Where does one culture start? Where does it end? How do I perform my identity of being Mexican and American at the same time? So all of these phenomena that we can't really say, here you go, it's in my pocket, I'm going to point to it. That's what we have as a metaphysical component to the border.
What is hybridity?
Hybridity is this place of in-betweenness, that you are comfortable with the fact that it's not necessarily one or the other. You don't know, and that's fine. So here we are comfortable with saying, I'm a Mexican American, and I don't have to pledge allegiance to just one or the other side of my culture or my identity or my nationality or even my language, right? It's this hybridity of coexisting and being okay with it.
Okay.
Thank
you.
You're
let
welcome.
me just modify those questions Kim asked. Is the hybridity part, is that what you're calling the metaphysics, right? So if metaphysics traditionally is beyond the physical, I can practice metaphysics anywhere, right? But it seems like what you're saying is the way I practice metaphysics could be different because of the physics of the border. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a lot of unique elements here that make it this different dimension that is very different from any other part of the world. The fact that we have different nationalities, different languages, different cultures, the fact that we have to prove who we are every single time we cross. Like how we perform our identity is very different every single time. And that in itself gives it a different component. And like I said, there are borders everywhere, but there's none like the one we have here. We have these polarized dichotomies of El Paso being the safest city in the world, Juarez being the most dangerous. And yet, despite it all, we coexist in these contradictions, and somehow we're sister cities, despite being so different. So I think these are definitely unique elements that give another dimension to what we're doing here metaphysically.
Yeah, let me keep going in this direction a little bit, because Aristotle, who started this tradition of metaphysics, as you know, right, said practicing metaphysics is like knowing how to speak the language of thought, which is the language of God or the divine. And part of that was distinguishing in what language do I normally converse? What's the normative language, right? And so that would have been Greek. And any other language besides Greek was barbarism. So,
which is interesting because that's what we have here, right? You either speak pure English or pure Spanish, or the Spanglish we don't legitimize.
Exactly. So I mean, if you want to go metaphysics and take up a thread, you know, from Aristotle in terms of language, right? That kind of hybridity of accepting both languages goes already against the grain.
Right, and I think that's exactly what we're meant to do in the border. We're not going to follow these prescriptive sort of dogmatisms, because in order to survive, people have to use translanguaging. Otherwise, they can't communicate.
Right.
In order to survive, we have things that we call el jale chicano. It's a rope. You're not supposed to use it in specific ways, but we use it because that's all we have, and somehow it works. It's not supposed to be that way, but we make it that way because out of necessity, this is how we've managed to survive for so many years. So yeah, I appreciate that analogy to Aristotle, but I think in many ways, the border is a place in which you're supposed to challenge and contest what is supposed to be the norm, because things are not necessarily linear. Things happen just so dynamic, and they're just improvised in many ways.
I wonder, I wonder if there was a mix of Macedonian and Greek that Aristotle secretly spoke, and just, you know,
He just didn't write it.
he just wrote in Greek, right? And but we don't know, right?
We don't know.
My guess is that there was.
Well, there's a the reason why I bring that up is because
Mazagreekian.
right, because even in the tradition of philosophy, contemporary philosophy, there are those who practice philosophy who say there's one right way of doing philosophy.
Right.
And so here on the border, I mean, given that we have this border condition, that is, as you, in quoting Juan Gabriel, it's totally different here. Total
Yeah.
diferente.
And I think that's the problem with academic philosophy as of right now. It's one of the most underrepresented academic fields in the humanities and perhaps in the world. It's supposed to exclude voices that come from the border. It's supposed to be predominantly white, Eurocentric, and anything that deviates is immediately seen as not legitimate. And I think that's precisely why we need to do this type of philosophy, because it's been absent for so many years, and because it's very much needed, because Greek philosophy did not have the complex challenges that we have here in the border in the year 2021, because Greek philosophy can serve definitely as a platform, but it does not provide us with the answers that we need now for us to move forward.
And so that leads us to the next question. Epistemically, how is working on the border different than working, you know, our question was as opposed to the mainland, right? But as opposed to the main tradition. How is epistemically, what insights do we gain from working on philosophy here on the border?
So I like that you frame the question in such a way in which you say from the main, because that immediately puts us at this periphery, at this margin, as the outside, right? Because it's a different type of phenomena. So here we have to answer questions of what counts as legitimate and valid knowledge, right? So I think one example that comes to mind is something that comes up in my classrooms. A lot of my students don't immediately see themselves connected to philosophy because they say these were Greek men from thousands of years ago. I am a Mexican-American student on the border, right? And then I tell them, well, hang on, you've been doing philosophy without necessarily realizing it. Think about all the dichos that you've heard in your family passed down for generations. Can those be philosophical? Traditional philosophy would say no, right? Because they weren't written down in a book. But these were passed down generations full of wisdom. So I think we epistemically have to reconsider, what are we going to count as legitimate knowledge? What is the role of lived experience? Because in academic philosophy, for the longest time, anything that comes from the lived experience is seen as anecdotal, and therefore we don't really trust it because it's not necessarily purely analytical or theoretical or objective, right? And I think epistemically, there's a small, but definitely there, change in terms of validating that lived experience and these voices that perhaps have something to say. And generationally, we've been ignoring them. So I think that's a small movement that is beginning, but I think it's full of force and it has a lot of power in terms of what can we constitute as epistemically valuable.
Yeah, right. Who gets to say what knowledge is?
Right. Or who gets to say what philosophy is, right? I think that's the challenge that we have in front of us.
Who do we create knowledge, or is it already established?
Well, we can definitely start to see that it's definitely not outsider people telling us this is who you are and this is how you should be. The answer has to lie in rediscovering who we are and what are we supposed to do with these experiences.
I think that precisely because we're doing philosophy here on the border, it makes it easier for us to question what knowledge is and what truth is and what is the claim for the what is established, because precisely because we're having to go back and forth between two different realities. And so it's not like somebody who is within a tradition and never goes outside of it much. I mean, maybe they go outside of it, but later in their lives, but they're always, somebody who's only an English speaker per se, right? And does not have to measure the world in centimeters, for instance, right? They don't have access to a different reality. And so there would be less questions about what is real, as opposed to somebody who's constantly having to negotiate between different people's realities, you know?
And that's exactly what it is. It's not just a navigation, but a negotiation.
Right.
You have contestation of identities every
And what is
single
real?
day. Exactly. 20 pesos is the equivalent of $1. So your reality changes when you cross. Are you going to have a lot of money, or are you going to have 20 times less? So there's a lot of differences that definitely change our perception of reality depending on the side of the border that we're in.
And time.
Time? Yes.
I want to this leads to the next question in our list of questions, right? Because traditionally, there are dominant categories in philosophy, like metaphysics and epistemology and logic,
Yes.
right? Those tend to bubble up to the top, you know, and Anglo-American philosophers say that's really all that's important. That's how we're going to navigate what's true and what's worth knowing, right? But would you say, or how would you respond to this, is that being on the border challenges those very hierarchies because, and you mentioned lived experience. Our lived experience is such that we have to take into account sociopolitical conditions differently
Absolutely.
than other people not living on the border, other philosophies. So in what way do the sociopolitical, you mentioned, you know, pesos and dollars, right? Sociopolitical economic conditions, you know, how does that influence practicing philosophy on the border?
How much time do we have?
Yeah,
Because
I know.
so
Right.
we are living in the front lines of international sociopolitical debates. What everybody is watching on television, what they're listening on NPR to, when they read the New York Times, we are living it every single day. So that's, in terms of lived experience, that's the difference, right? When somebody mentions DACA, it's this abstract concept. I get to live it when my students no longer come to class.
Right.
When we talk about Juarez being different from El Paso, I think about all the femicides and all the thousands of women that have gone missing, that we later find, that are raped, that are killed. This is a phenomena that we live, that I've experienced when I see the flyers, when I see social media, girls that we may know directly. When we talk about the issues of immigration, this is a debate that happens everywhere in the world, but when the media was talking about brown kids in cages, they were here in our backyard. When we talk about immigration, we're not just talking about those kids, we're talking about the Afghan refugees that just came to Fort Bliss a couple of weeks ago. And we have to figure out in our community, so what do? What is the right thing to do? Right? So notice that we're not going to go to a conference for an answer. We're not going to read an academic paper. We have to practice border philosophy on the ground immediately. This is the difference, right? That lived experience takes priority over any sort of theoretical understanding. There's a lot of other distinctions of what's happening here. We have maquiladoras. That's a phenomena that we have in Juarez, which means we have hundreds of factories that have lured young kids into this hyper exploitation.
Mostly women?
Mostly women, mostly young women that cannot have the opportunity to go to school, to get a bachelor's, to get a master's, much less a PhD. So we have this very real, complex sociopolitical just type of challenges that, again, these are not things that we read about, these are things that we live, and they keep growing. Like right now, we're getting ready for us to reopen our borders after they've been closed for the duration of the pandemic so far. Like that has so many more implications. Then it means our students are gonna have to wait longer than the 3 hours that they used to wait in order for them to make it in time for class. So just being here is completely different than what we assume a traditional community would be like. And I think that in itself is intrinsically philosophical, and that's what leads us to have to take a more pragmatic approach into solving these challenges.
Yeah, well, and it's
It reminds me, I want to sound smart too. It reminds me of Hegel, the owl of Minerva always flies at night. You know, if only philosophy would remember to be humble, instead of trying to humble and you know, remembering that philosophers are analyzing the lived experience and coming to conclusions about the lived experience, but the lived experience is always first, as opposed to the other way around.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to make a comment about that, and that in philosophy, what often gets the charge against philosophy, and it's happened since, you know, the beginning of the 20th century, when philosophy made this turn to language, right, and positive, you know,
Positivism.
logical positivism and analytic philosophy. But the charge then is that philosophers only care about making these hair-splitting distinctions, and that they're all caught up in their ivory towers. But here on the border, we have this lived experience which affects and impacts the way we practice philosophy, because we can't just put aside our embodied conditions. The very bridges that connect us often are housing immigrants or refugees or exiles underneath them. You know, as you say, you know, they're kept in cages and stuff, and oftentimes, you know, in the past couple of years, they've been putting people under the bridges even, and so the bridges themselves that are supposed to be connectors, you know, are being used for these very problematic ways of dealing with other people.
How does that, our next question is, given all these conditions, you know, and traditional logic of a set identity, right? A equals A, and if you have an A and a not A, that's a contradiction. And if you have a contradiction, that doesn't make sense, so we have to throw that out. But here on the border, like you're saying, there's a constant contradiction. How does that, I love it, right? Because to me, like, teaching logic here is when the students are, but miss, you know, that doesn't make sense, because because they're living it, right? So how does teaching, we talked about epistemology, and so how about logic? How does living here on the border challenge a traditional logic of a set identity?
When I think about logic in a traditional academic sense, I immediately think of these very rigid, prescriptive structures that must be followed. And I think that does not apply here, because this is a life of improvisation. Things do not flow from A to B. So I think, logically speaking, there's a lot of things that happen here that should not make sense, but make sense. Right? The fact that we are living, again, this polarized dichotomy of how do you have, like, this border community of the safest city in the world and the most violent, simultaneously, like, being one community. Like, I think there are a lot of challenges to our traditional understanding of what logic is that happen here. So
how roles are used.
Exactly.
As opposed to followed.
Absolutely. And I think that's the interesting ethical dimension, right?
Oh, and that leads to the next question, you know, because we have logical contradictions that kind of pop up. And so that impacts the way that we understand things. But when we get to ethics, we're dealing with how do we make decisions on how to act, right? So does living here in La Frontera, as a philosopher, I know you teach ethics all the time. You've been teaching ethics for years, right? Many years. So when you teach ethics, are you teaching it in such a way that you teach it with these dynamics of the border in mind?
I have to.
How ethics, how people living here, students especially, make decisions differently and choose different approaches to ethics.
Yes, absolutely. I think in order for ethics to be appealing to my students, I have to teach it from a standpoint of it being relatable to their lived experience. And I think if there was ever an epicenter of applied ethics, we are in it in the border, right? Because of the sociopolitical issues we just mentioned, because we can't really escape ethical dilemmas are all around us every single day. So it's not like I have to pinpoint to chapter 5 and say, let's analyze this ethical dilemma. It's what's happening around us in our community. And these are students that come from Juarez and El Paso, and then we have these very interesting discussions. I think the main distinction that we have to make here, though, is for students to differentiate between legality and morality. Because if, again, there was ever a place that separated the two,
What is
here.
the difference? Could you tell us more?
I can give you an example. Recently, we had our El Paso community bringing in at least 30,000 maquiladora workers that did not have any visas or any legal documents to cross into the U.S. to get vaccinated. And it was for the sake of the border community. So here we have to analyze, was it the right thing to do? Well, I mean, legally, you shouldn't come if you don't, that's what some people say. You shouldn't come if you don't have the documents, right? But who cares about that? We're doing it for the greater good. We bring these people in because it's for the best interest.
It's the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do, right?
Right.
When my students are late for class because they had to wait in the bridge crossing for 3 hours, do I go by the book of, oh no, you're late? Or am I going to use my best judgment and do the right thing to do in this particular context? And I think being in the border forces us to be a bit more particular and a bit more contextual. And while there has to be some universal values, absolutely, we have to just be flexible and understand that, again, there's a lot of in-betweenness and a lot of complexity and a lot of hybridity, and that requires also this ethical navigation.
Yeah, there's another, so I also work with environmental ethics, right? And so being more flexible and aware of the hybridity and this kind of back and forth cultural identity that causes us different kinds of issues, those kinds of lived experiences are almost seem manageable compared to some of the environmental problems and the environmental differences. Like, and the biggest example I have is, you know, I had a conference on water a decade ago here in El Paso. And what I found out was on this side of the border, El Paso, we have the only inland desalinization plant to draw water up from underground so that we in El Paso can have clean drinking water. And the citizens in Juarez don't.
I'm hoping
they don't have anything like that, right? They don't have anything like that or access to the technology that we do here. So there's that. And the other thing that is really, you know, ethically challenging for me and for all of us, we were able to have that kind of environmental privilege or advantage because of our economic superiority, basically.
And military.
And it was paid for by the military.
Well,
so there's a much different situation going on in Juarez because a lot of people in Juarez don't even trust the military or the police for that matter because of the problems with the narcos, right?
And at the same time, right, despite this economic superiority, there are people in the United States still dying because they don't have access to health care. But if you cross the border for $2.50, you can walk into any Farmacia Similar or Benavides and see a doctor immediately.
Oh, that was a brilliant thing to go from environmental to health.
It's again another example of these very polarized realities, right? So despite our economic superiority in the US, that does not necessarily translate to superiority in every other aspect because over there, despite the poverty, we have
better health care.
Better health care.
Access to better health care, right?
Yeah. And in many cases, better health care too.
Yeah.
This is the best place to be, you know?
You get the best and the worst of both worlds simultaneously. And probably the best food, I would say.
And so that's my next question. Aesthetically, we could ask Jules, tell us what is aesthetics, because you teach aesthetics. So there's so much there. How are they, what is the aesthetics of the border? But could you elaborate on what is aesthetics?
Well, aesthetics is a discipline that got developed with philosophers to talk about our sensually engaged experience with the world. So it's how we describe
Our senses.
Our sensual experience, right? What's our sensual experience with the world? How are we affected by what we see, by what we touch, by what we smell, taste, feel? So that's all aesthetics, right? Including music,
What we hear.
And
including
food.
food.
How we dress.
Right, but even to the point where, what kind of art do we
The
do on the
music
border? How is
we
art?
play.
How does art impact what we're doing on the border
Corridos.
differently?
How is corridos the music of the border, right?
Right.
Or Juan
So
Gabriel.
art and aesthetics are bound up with each other because the artist takes as his or her special.
What is
task.
considered beautiful here on the border?
Oh, that's a really nice question.
What is considered beautiful is another contradiction.
Yeah.
I've yet to meet somebody that says, I don't like Juan Gabriel. But yet, right, in terms of logically speaking, he was a homosexual man that society is set up
Especially
to.
Mexican.
A Mexican homosexual man.
Yeah.
Who is a lot of man.
A lot of man. And yet he was able to challenge this cultural machismo. The men that say I'm the biggest man ever love him, right? Because here, things that are supposed
We'd be crying to his songs.
not make sense, make sense. That's another example of aesthetically speaking, things are different here. In terms of music, we have wonderful music like his songs that we have 6-year-olds liking. And in any other part of the world, like a ballad, a romantic song, why would anybody, that sounds boring, not to us, right? Just a couple of weeks ago, our houses were celebrated with Halloween and Dia de los Muertos, and that's completely normal because we celebrate both. For the fall festival here at EPCC, our student clubs have to decide what theme they're going to go for the fall festival, which usually lines up with Halloween. And my students one year said, we're going to all be Disney characters. And the next year, cholos. And that's totally normal because it flows, because we go from one extreme to the other, and that's how it is. So I think aesthetically there's a lot of interesting things happening in terms of food, right? When we go to a buffet here, it's normal to have chicharrón verde, and then biscuits, and it's just this hybridity of food.
Yeah, so I want to share a little story here. So before 9/11, well before 9/11, before the border got closed down, and there was much more openness, like in the late 90s, early 2000s, right, where you could still go back and forth freely, right? I was, as a younger man, I got involved in some, races, 10K races or 20K races. And there was this international race that El Paso co-hosted with Juarez. And so we would start at the Chamizal, and we would gather, and then we would run across the Free Bridge and run through Juarez and come back across the Pay Bridge, and then end up back in the park, right? So the first time I did it, I started and I ran across the bridge, and I was in the main pack, and I got into Juarez, and we would be running through the streets in Juarez, and I'm running through these streets in Juarez, and my senses are filled with all of these smells from the little shops that are cooking all these great foods, right?
Of course.
And I'm just saying, oh man,
And
I just
you're
can't
listening
wait to
to
get
the
something
music.
to eat, right?
Burritos in the finish
and I
line.
get to the El Paso side, and I'm running through the downtown El Paso, and there's all these big empty buildings.
Yeah.
There's not all these little restaurants filled with
Music-wise, too, the
wonderful
sounds coming out of the
smells
streets.
and this kind of almost welcoming feeling of, come sit down with us and share a meal or something like that. So you
Who
get,
cares about the race?
Yeah.
You
Had
want
to
to
take a
follow
break
the
and eat.
smell. Absolutely.
Yeah, so we have big, imposing buildings here in the El Paso side, but there's that kind of intimacy that has to do with food and eating and welcoming that you experience on the Juarez side, which is not not quite here.
I want to talk about the creativity that comes out of living on the border,
Yeah,
aesthetically, precisely because, like Ms. Gomez mentioned, in terms of the jale chicano, right? Or it made me think of rascuache, right? You have to get creative to make do with what you have.
Oh yeah, this was the improvisation you were talking about.
Yeah, and we have some of the most beautiful murals in the world.
Oh, they're famous.
They're famous internationally. We drive by Segundo Barrio, we ignore them, but we have people from all over the world coming and documenting just the symbolism of all the culture and the heritage that they represent. So I think that's very unique, and I think it's very powerful, and I wish we could appreciate it a little bit more, just because it's right in our community, but we don't really fully understand the magnitude of the creativity and the symbolism more than anything that goes into them.
Yeah, well, I say I'm not. That's not one of my sins. So because I work in aesthetics, so one of the things that was my one of the tasks that I was tasked with whenever we did interviews for hiring people is I was assigned the task of bringing our guest, our potential hire, through downtown El Paso and into Segundo Barrio, and I would show them the murals. I'd say, this is the kind of culture you're coming to, right?
And show them the wall. You can show them the wall these days.
And
Incomplete wall.
And I went to the wall too and showed them, and this is the sociopolitical reality, that it comes right up to Chihuahuita, right? And
to
it's
the playground,
right in the middle, to a playground right up against the wall, right? So children grow up playing next to the wall. What an aesthetic that is. You know?
We recently had the art installation of Border Tuner, where we had these lights that would connect, and then these huge speakers that would send messages. And again, that was something that was recognized worldwide because of the creativity. Where else are you going to connect with light and with sound, two very divided parts of the world? So I think just like that example, we have a lot of magnificent artists here that don't necessarily get the recognition that they deserve.
That because of the creativity that comes out of here, I'm just still in, because of what it is. And I also think the potential for other countries, right, who are very divided, to see how we still continue to manage to work together. And anyway, I'm just like, this is the best place to be. And also, I wanted to put in a plug for one of our colleagues, Mr. Valenzuela's show, Creative Thinkers. And that's exactly what he does. He interviews people here from the community and explores what creativity means to them and how they are creative. So it's very apropos to what we're talking about. I would like to ask a couple more questions because I want to get to this one. Well, we've covered the areas of philosophy, so are there any other areas of philosophy you find more salient here? A lot of sociopolitical, the aesthetics, the ethics, any other areas that you, some of them that you work on that are very here, on the border, you see them coming out more, that are more salient here than maybe that the mainland or the main tradition?
Yeah, I think existentialism would definitely be my top choice in terms of constantly asking this question of who are we? How do we perform our identity when it's so complex and it's so hybrid? How do we authentically manifest who we are when we're told you have to pick one side or the other? So definitely I think existentialism would be at the top. It's a very complex question, and I think the answer is even more difficult to get to. Our community was forever changed on August 3rd, 2019, when we had this white supremacist gunman drive over 600 miles and target us precisely for who we are. And the people at that Walmart where he killed 23 people were from Juarez and from El Paso, and we had to finally understand that we were targeted as one.
We're all brown.
Exactly. Like, despite you are from Juarez, you're from El Paso, I'm Mexican American, I'm Hispanic, I'm Chicano, I'm Latinx, I'm whatever, for these racist enemies, we are one. And I think, existentially speaking, that's very complex for us to try to understand, right? Despite these divisions that are there, like, who are we, and why would somebody target us for who we are? I think that's the existential question that would remain.
I also think of the femicides and feminism.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. I mean, if there was ever a place for us to understand feminist theory and just feminism in general, it's in Juarez and El Paso. Recently, Judith Butler, who we consider to be the ultimate feminist icon, said she didn't think it was a good idea for the mothers of all these murdered girls in Mexico to be using violence when they started protesting. And I think that's a very comfortable thing to say when you're living the ivory tower celebrity type of lifestyle. But the lived experience of these mothers and the desperation, the frustration of doing everything by the book and still the authorities doing absolutely nothing, I think that's a different perspective that also needs validation. So existentialism, feminism, I mean, there are many others, but I think those would be.
Yeah, the last time I checked, I don't think there was even yet any union organization in any of the maquiladoras in Juarez. Is that still the case? I know there was.
Right. To me, that is so salient, right? I remember reading Marx and coming from Juarez, it's like, of course, you know?
Right.
Yeah, class consciousness, to me, understanding the workers' right or the exploitation of workers.
Well, especially female workers. I mean, it's almost the case that female workers are sought out because they're not going to be militant enough to create any kind of representation for themselves. Right?
We have people
so
like
they're so
Terrazas.
culturally, traditionally oppressed that they're unable to organize.
Although they have been more recently.
Ironically, it's a woman, Susana Terrazas, who has been persecuted and even jailed for fighting for workers' rights.
Right.
But we don't have that many, and the ones that we do have become immediately othered and targeted. Yeah.
Targeted, right? So that's problematic. And the sad part is that that where there is a division, there is a wall, right? There's a separation, and rather than supporting. Rather than
there is
mutual support.
Yeah, no, there is, like instances like the one that Manuela was mentioning of the maquiladora workers being shipped to El Paso to get vaccinated. Right. And more than anything, for many of us, some of our family members are still living and good friends, in Juarez. So this is, even though politically, the political animal is a leviathan, on the ground, people are connected.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I'm going to come back to our list of questions here, which has to do with, as philosophers, as a philosopher, do you adopt some kind of border philosophy to address these changes? So there's metaphysics, there's ethics, sociopolitical philosophy. Is there a kind of border philosophy that you identify specifically to address the way you teach differently, or the way you want your students to think differently?
Yes.
As border philosophers or something like that?
Yeah, I think it would have to be philosophy in action, which is something that I've committed a lot of my work to.
Oh, that's great.
I've made sure that we're not just discussing philosophy, but we're doing philosophy in the community. During this pandemic, my students and we made over 2,500 reusable face masks, and this came out of an ethics discussion of what is the right thing to do. This is at a time where there was a toilet paper shortage. We don't have face masks anywhere. And it started with this wild idea of, let's make face masks. Nobody knew how to sew, but then it shows the power of just a couple of people coming together and borrowing sewing machines and getting patterns online and fundraising. And it was very important for us to make sure that we distributed these masks with the most vulnerable members of our community on both sides, right? So we went to migrant shelters in Juarez, we went to homeless shelters here in El Paso. We had another discussion about, we talk a lot about how indigenous people are othered and marginalized, and then somebody brought to our attention that there was over 800 kids in Cuauhtemoc, Chihuahua that weren't going to get any Christmas gifts because of the pandemic. And we originally had committed to, we'll help with 100. And then we came up with over 800. And I think that is extremely powerful for us to stop this just discussion, which is helpful, but then it ends there. And it's saying, okay, let's get our hands dirty. How do we do this? How do we collect all of this? So I think border philosophy is this, us discussing what is so different about the border, and it's us going back into our community and making sure that these things change, and that contributions can be small, but nonetheless they are creating an impact. And it's just so wonderful to see the willingness of our students, because these are the same students that are considered non-traditional, that are considered low income, that traditionally society would say, well, what kind of power do they really have? And they become the most powerful agents. They discover themselves in the process of contributing to their own community. So I would say that is my border philosophy, making sure that we're improving both sides of our border with what a lot of academic philosophers would still say, well, how is that philosophy? Well, you're not meant to understand it anyway. Like, you won't get it.
Yeah, let me amend that, add an addendum to that. So the problem there is that some of our colleagues talk about philosophy being all about problem solving, right? But this is a way different kind of problem solving, because the problem solving that these other philosophers tout, you know, as the way to do philosophy is solving puzzles.
In ideal theory.
Exactly.
Puzzles,
These
right?
very fun
Not
puzzles.
addressing real problems in the world.
Thought
right?
experiments.
Thought experiments.
Yeah,
exactly.
armchair philosophy.
I am so skeptical of the whole thought experiment approach to practicing philosophy.
Here it's like we don't need to think about it.
It's in
right
front of
there.
us.
Right.
It's right there.
We
and
just
what
need
are
to
you gonna
get
do
Let's
about it?
imagine a
get
brain in
out
a
of
jar.
our classrooms.
No, we don't have time for that.
Right, and get, as you mentioned, get our hands dirty. Get to work, right? And that issue of getting to work takes on a whole different dimension when we're practicing philosophy in action or border philosophy. You know, as you put it, philosophy in action, right?
And I think it makes the type of philosophy that we need inevitably pragmatic and urban and accessible.
Yeah, so I was going to come to that eventually, because I know both you and Kim met, you know, in this kind of pragmatic tradition way, right? So you had similar teachers, and have this pragmatic background. But even pragmatism,
Absolutely.
as an institutional entity, you know, was kind of a little moribund. But I think this opens up pragmatism to a whole new kind of dimension. You know, this kind of border philosophy or philosophy in action, right?
Absolutely. I created this concept of desenterrando conocimientos, which is something that I'm elaborating on and working on, which translates to unearthing knowledge that comes from the tierra, from the ground up, in the lived experience, in the interactions, in the everyday working and getting our hands dirty. There's a lot of wisdom that can be unearthed, desenterrada. So I think theoretically there's still work there as well, but it's definitely a matter of hands-on philosophy.
Well, you know, I'm glad you put it that way as well. Theoretically, there's a lot of work. So in this philosophy of action or border philosophy, it's not like we're dropping the traditional distinctions of theory and practice. It's just that we're teaching theory or philosophy in a way that's wed more organically to how we practice in the world. I think that's what's going on here at the border, and that's what you're talking about, right?
It's a lot more relatable.
Theory and practice merges, you know, because when we're talking about the practice, theoretically, it's right here outside our door. So there's that much more
urgency.
Urgency, yeah, that much more sense of relevance.
Yeah.
The context of relevance is much different.
I would like to follow up by asking, as a human being, how does being and working from the border help or affect how you relate to others? In other words, how does being on the border affect how you live your life?
Well, I think because of all the reasons we've talked about, inevitably, I've been exposed to a lot of tragedy and a lot of suffering and a lot of injustice. And I think that's changed me in a way in which, instead of choosing to become bitter or a victim, it's allowed me to create empathy and to want to have even more of this drive to change. And I've found that in philosophy as this tool for change. Mm-hmm. So I think that's how it's impacted me the most. It's obviously opened my philosophical horizons to be on the border, just because it's given me new understandings and different dimensions of anything that has to do with philosophy, like we've talked about, like epistemology, metaphysics, logic, sociopolitical issues, ethics, existentialism. But I think just as a human being, it's allowed me to be a little bit more understanding. I wouldn't say that I'm fully empathetic and understanding, but I have this very special sense because of living here that I'm very sensitive to these types of phenomena that happen here.
Yeah, well, phenomenologically, your perspective, my perspective is different if I'm standing on one side of the river or one side of the fence than if I'm standing on the other. And not only that,
or if you're straddling both, right?
Well, not only that, just to be able to straddle both, is already a different kind of perspective. And even getting back and forth is a different kind of perspective, right?
Absolutely.
If I have a card to get through, one time I was flying out of the airport in Juarez, and as I came back, I got to the border to pass back into El Paso. And there's this huge line of hundreds and hundreds of people, right, backed up, going through the checkpoint, right? And I noticed there was a bunch of white people going down in between the line, just passing me. I was standing in line,
but you
minding my business.
But you saw the other white people, and you're like,
I saw the other white people.
No,
no, the woman behind me who was Mexican, says to me, why are you standing here? You get to go down the middle. So I went down the middle. And sure enough, I get to the front of the line, passing hundreds of people on both sides. And because I'm a US citizen and Caucasian, I pass through in a few minutes. And here, there's this whole, backed up mass of people that are spending so much time of their life just standing in line, right? And so there's definitely oppression at the border, and there's privilege at the border.
Yeah, absolutely. That's just one of the many injustices that...
Contradictions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One of the many injustices. Yeah, and I think it's an issue of justice. And we don't take that seriously enough. Especially those of us who can, and teachers, who can teach those kinds of lessons. We just go on teaching.
Or to teach the ones that are in
traditional metaphysics
line,
or traditional epistemology, right?
or to teach the ones that are in line to call it out and to speak up and to say, no, I go first. I was here first, right? So it works both ways. And that's something that I try to arm my students with. If you see injustice, you stand up, you speak up. It's going to make you uncomfortable, but sometimes it's the only way, right? Because people won't always have this introspective analysis of saying, should I? Is that wrong? They'll go, and you have to say no.
Yeah.
Why? So I think that's the role of us as philosophy
teachers.
teachers.
In my example, my lived world example, right? The best thing to do would have been to say, well, there should just be 3 lines, then everybody's going to go through a little faster.
And you're doing more than also teaching them to stand up and say something, because, interestingly, right? I think it's something like 80%, or I forget exactly the percentage of the people who actually man the border, right? And this is something that we talked about briefly with our colleague Victor from UACJ. he points out, you know, it's precisely Mexican Americans who are enforcing these rules, right? And so by teaching and asking these questions, you know, so even if somebody doesn't speak up, is not there yet, at least you're putting them in a position where they have to ask themselves, what is the right thing to do here, given my context
and my power.
And the power that coming out of Ms. Gomez's class I am to have, right? Or I'm training for.
Yeah, just so there's no hyperbole, you taught me this. It's that the official figure is 60%.
Okay.
60%. But we're coming close towards the end, so we want to ask you if you have any questions of us.
Comments, anything else that, we haven't talked about.
Yeah.
I just think that this project of having these philosophic dialogues of La Frontera is very much needed, like I mentioned, and I think it's a step in the right direction of validating border philosophy. I can't tell you how many conferences I've been to where we still have this question of, is there a Mexican-American philosophy? Is there a philosophy of the border? And I think we shouldn't waste our time with those questions anymore. We should be
just
practicing and doing it, and moving past that in terms of having productive dialogues that are going to lead to actions that hopefully and eventually will lead to changes that will improve our border community, and perhaps this serve as an example for other parts of the world that have similar challenges. So yeah, I'm very excited to be a part of this, and I'm looking forward to the many fruitful bits and pieces of wisdom that you get to gather from your guests.
Well, and not only that, from our viewers, you know, hopefully we're going to get a broad viewer, a broad
Have
audience.
them send mail and stuff like that,
Yeah,
like
that's
old
right.
school
And
stuff.
questions.
Yeah, send us your questions.
Yes, that would
Your
be.
deep philosophical questions.
Yeah,
Yes.
about the big issues in life, because that's what we're here. We're having fun with raising these questions, you know, enjoying ourselves, raising them, but also taking them seriously.
I don't know if I have time for one more comment. I like this also legitimizing for you as a teacher, legitimizing your students' experience by saying, desenterrando conocimiento, it's already there. You're not learning it from some authority figure.
Right.
In the tradition.
Yeah.
You already have it.
Right.
I think that's so empowering, especially for people here.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think that's been the key for students to resonate with that idea, the fact that I'm one of them. I'm a border student. I've been here my whole life. I've encountered these challenges, and I can connect with them in that sense.
And I think on that note, we want to thank you for being a border philosopher and joining our show.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation.
Sharing your time and your energy with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us. Again, we are Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera. Our guest today was Ms. Manuela Gomez, philosophy faculty here at EPCC. And my name is Kim Diaz.
And I'm Jules Simon.
Please join us next time.